Welcome everybody to Third Thursday. I think this is our third Thursday, maybe. We have, I'm just gonna jump right into it. We have Pat Bowen here to give a talk. It's probably her last talk. As you all know, she's retiring and pretty excited about it. I could spend the rest of the hour in an introduction to Pat, but mostly I want to thank her for the support that she's given the BC Wine Grape Council over the years. She's really been the science heart of the council for us. She's given us so much advice and guidance and insight and inspiration over the years, and she really has been the heart of the team at Summerland as well, and they've all provided industry with that kind of support, and it's just been awesome. And you know, she's managed our expectations, and she's also kept us excited about science the whole time. So thanks very much, and I'll let you go, Pat.
Well, yeah, thank you very much, Kathy and Kate, for organizing this. I really appreciate this. This will be my last presentation to the Wine Grape Council. You know, it's been an absolute pleasure, but an honor to work with such a progressive and generous and outgoing and engaging industry. And I could talk about that too, as Kathy said. It's just been amazing. I wish I could see all of your faces here, because both Carl and I feel so fortunate to have worked with such a great industry and with the team also at Summerland, which has been fantastic. So with that, before I start like getting sobby or whatever, something like that, I'm going to share my, not sure why this is not working. Oh, here we go. Can you see that? Can you see that? Is anyone?
Yes, we can see it, Pat. Yep. That looks great.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you. Just checking.
Yep.
Okay. So because it's my last presentation, I thought I would give kind of a summary overview of the GIS work we've been doing over the last 21 years in collaboration with the industry. So there's lots of different tools that we can use with GIS. You know, the couple of them I'm going to focus on and a chunk on is on characterizing soil carbon, because it's become an important topic for the industry and the public at large. But I'll also talk a little bit of detail on defining appellations, because I get a lot of questions on that from the growers still and how that all works. So, geographic information system for viticulture in the Okanagan and Similkameen valleys. That was our first project that we started beginning in 2000. And there's myself and Carl Bogdanoff and Scott Smith, our great collaborator and colleague, who is our soil specialist that we worked with over the many years till he retired a few years ago. Actually, we're still working with him. So we conducted that project, or started it then, but we're still adding to the GIS. We're still, and even right now, we're still mapping vineyards and adding more information. So what a GIS is it's a map-based data management system. And the goal of that work way back then, and it continues to be, is to create a body of scientific knowledge on terroir in the Okanagan and Similkameen, and now it's expanded to the coastal areas as well. So the original objectives were to characterize terroir, site conditions, climate and soil, topography, define growing regions based on terroir as an argument towards sub-appellation development, then demonstrate terroir effects on suitability of cultivars, wine character, using Merlot as an example. Then we did some work in collaboration with Benoit Girard and Kevin Usher when he was a postdoc on Chardonnay, flavor and aroma chemistry. I've worked a lot on vineyard water use efficiency, and then with Tom Lowry and Jose Urbez Torres on pest and disease outbreaks. We've collaborated with Miranda Hart on soil microbial ecology work with our grad student, Taylor Holland. We're currently doing some work with Lizzie Volkovich from UBC on grapevine phenology. And the current work I'm focusing on is soil carbon sequestration. All of these studies making use of the GIS. So it's a layered database. So geographic information system means layered spatial database. And it's a really good system to use in a living lab approach to viticulture research. So the first layer is the geolocated vineyard blocks. So we map all the vineyards and we're continuing to do that. Then we add the terroir information, the landform features, topography, climate, and soil characteristics. A lot of work on the soil. The viticulture, so we have information on the cultivars, training, trellising systems, crop protection, irrigation, and nutrition practices. And then we have an ecology component, so flora, soil microbes, pest predators, outlying ecology. A lot of that work has been in collaboration with Tom and Jose and Miranda Hart, getting that information in there. Disease and pest incidents, those same colleagues on crop protection.
Hi.
Hello? I thought I heard someone talking. Okay, sorry. Cold hardiness, that's Carl's work, is in there. And then finally, we even have information on vineyard performance, including the usual wine quality, grape quality, but even medal winning vineyards so that we can, as an indicator of quality. So how it works, for example, just use cold hardiness. So we take the information on cold hardiness and then look at relationships with, say, terroir or landform features and get a better insight into what affects cold hardiness. Or we look at viticulture practices and or combine them, and it really gets a more richer picture of what's going on in the valley and in the vineyards. So early on, in about 2003 or 4, we carved the valleys up into regions based on their terroir, just to see if it made sense to go ahead and promote to do sub-appellations. So you've probably seen this many times. And so we looked at the heat units, the growing degree days, and the terroir in the regions, and then describe these. And it became very clear that even though the Okanagan Valley is really small, we have huge differences in terroir in the valley. Kelowna being very cool, about 1,200 growing degree days, all the way down to Osoyoos with about 1,600. And then these differences, we put quite a bit of effort into soil characterization. We found these huge differences in soil, very fine textured clayey soils in the Kelowna area, silt loams and fine sandy loams in Penticton. And then all the regions in the south have these incredibly coarse textured soils, a lot of gravel, loamy sands, and actually soils that are classified as sand. And that's unusual for a grape growing area. And so using the GIS, we could even look at what are the proportions of planted areas or blocks in these different soils. We have 60% of the vineyards are on loamy sands or sands, and another quarter on sandy loam. Very coarse soils, and less than 15% still today on these clay loams or silt loam soils. So this has implications, particularly related to soil carbon, as I'll talk about a little more in a minute. It's important, though, that we don't deny that we have incredible soil variation in the valley. So this is just an example of Summerland and Naramata showing the different soil types that we find even in a small area or even within an individual vineyards. So although we have these generalizations, say like textural classes, we still have to help our growers deal with soil variability in the vineyard. So thus some of the precision management work that we're starting to engage in more now. So this is a map. This is Inkami Vineyard that this was published in Geoscience Canada in 2005. Boy, time flies. So here's their map, and this is the typical base map we produce for growers showing their variety blocks and acreage. and we provide that back. And what that does, having those GPS blocks, that allows us to take a thumbprint in the GIS system, overlay it on a soil map, and get an idea of the different soils in that vineyard. Sometimes they can be a bit off from the survey. So Scott Smith and Wayne Blash, all these specialists, have gone into all these vineyards and verified those soils. And then we add this block onto the soil maps we give back that describes the stoniness and the textural class. That textural class is important when designing irrigation systems and for nutrient management. Okay, so I'm going to focus on some of the current work that we're doing under the CAP project, and it is looking at soil carbon in the Okanagan and Similkameen. It's a very popular topic and a topic of concern. And why we care about it is that carbon sequestered in soil represents 80% of the carbon in terrestrial ecosystems. That's a lot of the carbon. It's all stored in a narrow band of the soil. This is a vineyard soil, and the top horizon is A and the second one is B. Most of the carbon is just in that, 15 to 20 to 30 centimeter band. That's a lot of storage in a small area. Okay, so it's vulnerable there. Soil carbon is cycled, organic matter is added to the soil, there's decayed plant debris, animal waste, and dead animals and microbes. So there's always carbon being added. Active soil carbon, which is a portion of that total carbon, a small portion, is that kind of carbon that can be consumed directly by microbials and released as CO2. So those microbes degrade the organic matter, give off CO2, and contribute to nutrient cycle. Natural ecosystems, not farms, but say, the sage lands or forests, usually have very stable carbon levels. If you measure it every year, it doesn't change because there's a steady state that's being reached in these systems. In contrast, agriculture practices such as tillage, irrigation, fertilization can enhance microbial degradation of organic matter. So they really help those microbes grow, and they break down organic matter. So you might think, well, that's bad because they're breaking it down. But it depends on how much is being replenished, how much organic matter is being added, and what the balance is. So you need all those parts of the equation to see what's happening. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, you all know that, and practices that deplete soil carbon, the total, contribute to atmospheric CO2 and climate change. So there's a really good reason to care about this. A few years back, they found out that vineyards in California and other areas, such as in Europe, have depleted soil carbon, very depleted soil carbon relative to nearby natural sites, like the nearby forests or natural lands. So that industry, the grape growing industry, had a bad reputation for contributing to climate change. So for here in the Okanagan, our question is, does viticulture in interior BC reduce soil carbon? Are we like California? They till, so does Europe, but we're Canadians. Canadians are the inventors of zero-till systems. So let's see what that does. What are the native soil carbon levels in the area? Just as something to compare our levels with. And which management practices lead to soil carbon depletion or accumulation? So I think growers are interested in what they can do one way or another with their carbon. So as a grower and a business person, why should you care about soil carbon? So this picture here is, this time it's a natural soil, and you can see the A horizon is very thin. Most of the carbon is in that really thin band, but there's more of it below, but it's a very different system than a vineyard system. Okay, so why do you care about soil carbon? Well, grapevines need a healthy root system to flourish. Organic matter contributes to soil qualities that help the roots grow and function and the plant grow. It adds cation exchange capacity to soil, which helps hold and release plant nutrients. It increases soil water retention. These are all good things. Helps to reduce soil bulk density or the heaviness of the soil, so roots can grow more easily. It also creates pore space for gas exchange. So when those microbes are breaking down that carbon and roots are growing and respiring, there has to be some space, gas for pore space for the CO2 to collect and the oxygen to be brought into the soil. It contributes to active carbon in the soil, as I already mentioned, which feeds the microbes that cycle the nutrients and make them available to the plant. So it's part of that nutrient cycling, really important to the ecosystem. So I get asked how much organic matter is enough? And this is a really good question. And I think it depends on the ecosystem and production goals. So I think you can think of organic matter like food in a person. You need food. It's really important, just like carbon in soil. But how much do you need? Is there like an optimum amount, or is there too much? These are good questions. I think it depends on what you're doing, your production goals. We know that stable natural ecosystems, some of them in warm climates with sandy soils, like right here in the Okanagan, have very naturally very low soil carbon. And those natural plants can flourish on these soils. So maybe grapevines too. We're not looking for vineyards to produce a ton of leaf biomass. We just want the fruit. We actually want to keep vigor under control. So maybe we should think about optimum amounts of carbon and not high amounts or getting more and more and more. Okay, natural systems perhaps can guide target levels of organic matter for system stability and plant health. So these are the kind of the ideas and the hypotheses that we're thinking about when we're doing our work. So last year, despite COVID, we were able to do a campaign and collect soil samples through a contractor. Fortunately, we got our usual partners, Wayne Blashill and Scott Smith, under contract because they're the best people to do soil work, to collect these soil samples. So using our GIS, we identified 20 vineyards in some contrasting soils and production systems in the Okanagan and Similkameen. In each one of the vineyards, we chose 2 blocks separated. So it was really like 2 vineyards in one, get more information. So 2 sites, and then at each of those sites, we sampled from the vine planted row and in the alley. And then at each of those places, we took soil from 2 depths, 0 to 15 kind of representing that A horizon, and then 15 to 30. And then we noted the irrigation type, whether it was sprinkler or drip or dual. Now, the day we didn't have, I think there were only a couple of dual irrigated vineyards. And so I hesitated to report the data because it's not enough replication to be fair for comparisons, but then I put it in so you can have a look, but be careful about making comparisons when you see this. We also sampled similarly from 10 native natural sites near the vineyards for comparison. So there's only 10 because in areas like in the south, where we have a big concentration of vineyard area, 1 natural site could serve as the control for many vineyards. So we didn't need so many of those. Okay, so we had 180 of these soil samples, and we collected quite a bit of soil per sample so we could make a kind of soil library. So if someone else wants to come along and do microbial work, we can offer some of that soil up, we hope. It's there. So for the soil analysis, we use the lab. It's a really excellent lab, the BC Ministry of Environment, BC Analytical Chemistry Research Lab, and did very detailed analyses. So the textural components, sand, silt, and clay, percent carbon and active carbon, cation exchange, all these things that you analyze for, pH, percent nitrogen, available phosphorus, ammonium, and nitrate, and then the exchangeable cations, calcium, potassium, magnesium, iron, manganese, and sodium. So we just got these results a month ago. And so in between interviewing candidates, we were able to do some statistical analysis and analysis of this data because I was so eager to have a look at it. So what I'm showing here in this plot is percent carbon. And I have here in blue the vine row, and the red is the alley, and the green is the natural site for comparison. So in this one, we're looking at the effective depth, and this isn't surprising. There's more carbon in the surface than in the B horizon there. But we find that soil carbon is higher. This is on averaged over all the vineyards, and we found that soil carbon is higher in the vineyards than it is in native sites. This is fantastic news. So unlike in other areas where they're a target because they're depleting carbon, in the Okanagan and Similkameen, it looks like viticulture is actually increasing carbon sequestration. So carbon is higher in the vineyard alleys than in the rows, on average, averaged over all the vineyards. Okay, so active carbon is that portion that the microbes can consume. It's only a small portion of the total, only 2% of that total carbon, but you can see it follows exactly directly the same pattern. So if you have more carbon, you have more of that active carbon feeding those microbes. Okay, so in this set, we're looking at differences in irrigation methods. Okay, so what we found was soil carbon is higher in sprinkler than in drip irrigated vineyards, not so much in the planted row, but in the alley row. So the sprinkler irrigated vineyards are sequestering more carbon on average, and the active carbon is following that same pattern. Cation exchange, higher in the surface, 15 centimeters than below, just a bit higher, although significantly higher in vineyards than in native sites. Okay, the green is lower, so that's following the pattern with carbon. Higher in sprinkler than drip irrigated vineyards, particularly again in that alley. So the same in the planted row, but if you sprinkler irrigate, you get more. And you can see this result here for dual, and it doesn't follow, so we have to have a closer look at that data. Okay, so I just have an example of two of those nutrients. I don't have everything that we measured. Nitrate and phosphorus. Here you can see both nutrients are much higher, much higher than in the vineyards than in the native sites. Both nutrients are higher in the surface. I don't have this plot here, but they're higher in the surface like in the others. Nitrate was highest, a lot higher in the alleys of the sprinkler irrigated vineyards again. Okay, that same pattern. And phosphorus was higher overall in sprinkler than drip. Okay, so that's kind of averaged across all the vineyards. This is my last slide for carbon. I think it's pretty interesting what we found. We knew that we were seeing this, more carbon in the finer textured soils. In this plot, graphs, I've plotted percent carbon versus percent sand as an indicator of soil texture. It's a pretty good indicator. The blue dots are the vineyards. The green are the natural sites in both of these plots. So we have percent and active carbon again. So we fit these regressions. There's a lot of noise in here, but we can kind of pick through this and explain it. So coarser soils have less total carbon and active carbon. So we see this negative relationship here. On loam soils, okay, so I'm gonna add this line because it helps to understand what the soils are. So above this, these are all the sands and loamy sands, the very coarse textured soils. And on the left are the loams, the finer clayey loams, the silt loams, and the sandy loams in here, so the loamy soils. On the loam soil, so if you just look left of the red line, you can see that total and active carbon is higher in vineyards than in natural sites. So you see the green are down here, and then all of these high ones are in vineyards. And you see that with the active as well. Okay, so vineyards are really adding carbon, but only on those fine textured soils. If you look at on the sands and loamy sands here and here, all sand and loamy sand soils have very low carbon and active carbon, regardless of land use. So it didn't matter what these vineyard managers were doing in the vineyard, they could not get that carbon up over 1%. It's all under. You see a little bit of an increase with vineyards, not much. Same with the active. You see a bit of increase, but it just doesn't get up over 200 parts per million. Didn't matter what they did, how they managed their floors or whatever. About 60% of Okanagan Similkameen vineyards have sand or loamy sand soil. So this is 60% of the industry in here. Okay, more data. Obviously, we need to be looking at this more closely is needed to clarify our understanding of soil carbon processes in the Okanagan and Similkameen, and think about whether there should be a common goal to get everybody's carbon up to 3%, whether that is possible or reasonable or sensible. So these are some of the questions that you might have, and I can tell you that we're doing another round of sampling this summer. I'll be leaving partway through that sampling, but this will add to this database and continue with this work. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about Appellation development because I get asked about this a lot. There's a lot of people that think that somehow I have some say in it or whatever, just because we are consulted for information. So just to explain how this works in the history of how we have been involved and contributed to the knowledge used in delineating these new geographical indications that are being developed. So we have been contributing information, scientific information. Way back, the discussions, I think in 2002 or 3, there was some ideas about doing this and using some of this information. Some producers really want this badly and others don't understand the point of it. But I think there is a really good reason for marketers and consumers. They provide context and assure authenticity of wines through the labeling, and they describe where the wines are from. Sub-appellations provide more precise context for the wines. The descriptions, which are developed during the application process, provide rich information for producers and consumers of the wine. So going through the process of writing this up and describing it, you can actually learn more. There's a desire for science-based appellations versus those based on boundaries or politics or popular dogmas, such as everyone knows these wines taste like this and there's no scientific evidence. Okay, so as I already mentioned, this was like being pushed way back in the early 2000s. There was a lot of talk about how to do this properly. Finally, in 2009, the Wine Authority came out with a process for GI approval. It was a first stab. There's a lot of people complaining about it, but you have to start, put it through a trial, and then you can properly identify issues, I think. So that's what happened right away. The Golden Mile Bench people were interested in having one, and Scott Smith and I had a lot of meetings with them trying to define or interpret what the process the authority put out meant and what we should do. So we helped them. They did their best. It was submitted in 2014 and approved in 2015. I can tell you there were people unhappy with what happened, and there was some good reason for that, to improve it or refine it. In 2015, a task group of industry leaders assembled to review the process, and it was revised, which is great. And here's a quote from Anthony Gismondi. He said, "It now uses using a mix of science and common sense." That is such a great compliment for something like this, I think, is mixing good science and just common sense. So now what is revised is the proposals are come from industry and include the growers, not just the wineries. And conceptually and scientifically, it makes sense because the delineation is based on landforms. The landform being a geographic feature, like a valley or a mountain or a terrace or a fan. And why this makes sense is it's the landform characteristics that create and really affect the terroir. So if the terroir is a climate, soil, and topography, and the landforms create and affect the terroir, it makes sense to use the landform as the unit to base the appellation on. So that's what we've been doing, or helping grower groups in their applications. So just briefly, I'll go through what happens just to show that our role isn't to have a say. It's only if we're invited in to provide some advice. Scott Smith's been retired for a while, so he's available to consult with groups if they want him. Producers can write their own application and not have a consultant come in. That's perfectly legal and fine to do. So it's the producers that submit the proposal to the Wine Authority. There's a technical description required. Here's the front page of the Naramata benches. It includes the descriptions of the geography and landforms, soils, climate, extent of boundaries, meaning a map, and the viticulture, cultivars, and wine styles. A lot of that information comes out of that GIS work or work Scott and I have done to contribute that to the GIS. The proposal's reviewed by the authority, industry's consulted, and then there's a vote that requires 2/3. If that passes, it goes to the province. There can be more questions or revisions requested, but pretty soon, eventually, and it takes quite a bit of time, there's an approval. So here are the approved ones: the Naramata Bench, Skaha, OK Falls, Golden Mile, and Cowichan Valley. And Scott and I worked with him, Scott much more than I did. We did have all of their vineyards mapped in the GIS because we did a project with them and tried to get them in. I mean, no Wine Grape Council money was spent on this project. It was all A-based. Try to encourage the industry as a whole to come together. And so we worked with them using some of the mapping from the GIS. And it's not over. There's lots going on. There's these purple stars represent areas where there are proposals in progress right now at various stages, some very close to being submitted. As far as I know, there could even be some of those approved already, but it's a lot of back and forth with the authority. Okay, so that's Appellations. Now I'm just going to briefly go through some other examples, and I think some of these will be surprising where we use GIS. You think of GIS as being geography mapping. Everybody does in these layers, but we also use these tools to do some of our other work. For example, sensor mesh mapping. So we can set out a mesh of sensors, these green dots, little weather stations, synchronize them all, and that allows us to create maps of climate. So here we have a vineyard with a frost pocket and a cold air patch. And then after the frost fan operates, we can see how quickly it scours out. So that's the application of a sensor mesh and GIS for mapping. Now, you probably notice at the bottom of all these maps I'm presenting is map and spatial analysis by Brad Estegard, because Brad Estegard, who's my technician, he produced all these maps and did all the spatial analysis, and he is amazing and so valuable to the program. So I want to make sure you understand it's not me doing that, it's Brad making these maps. So sensor mesh mapping, again, this time it's vertical. Here, it's in the soil. So we're using GIS tools to map water in the soil. So we have irrigation applied on day one, wets the soil, and you can see it being depleted. The mesh is a number of TDR sensors, and we set that up to be able to understand how irrigation works in the soil. So there's another map. Another map, vertical map, is looking at microclimates in drip and sprinkler irrigated vineyards. So here's sprinkler, here's drip, and here are these frames. Brad has built these frames and put all these little weather stations with their little Stevenson screens in there and synchronize the measurements, and then we can map. So here's an example. This looks funny, this vine, but it's looking down the row. And so we have the mesh, the green dots are the sensors, and allows us to look at the spatial variation in temperature in these vineyards. You can see by using GIS tools, you can see easily the floor is very cool in sprinkler irrigated, really cool. In the fruiting zone, it's only 32 degrees compared to in the drip irrigated vineyard, it's 36 degrees. And look how hot that floor is. Okay, so you can see how helpful these tools are. The last few years, about 2 or 3 years, we've started doing drone imaging work for our precision management research. And these are our GIS maps made from captured images converted to indices that are related to vine growth. So from the image, we can, and many of you have done this with private companies doing NDVI, fantastic. So here's an eNDVI. similar for a vineyard that we put into the GIS. Other indices, green band reflectance, leaf canopy index. Okay, another application of the tools. So those are all indices calculated from micro imaging. So we're using reflected wavelengths. Here, this one is thermal imagery, so IR cameras. And so here's the image, the thermal image, and then Brad can overlay that on the vineyard and then convert it to a stress map based on the heat of only the canopy. So you can see in this vineyard, you take this thermal image, convert it into a zonal map for water stress, and that would allow the manager or guide the manager in precision managing the water, perhaps drawing back some of the application in this lower stress area and adding more to the high stress. So those are examples. Okay, in the last couple of years, we've realized that it makes sense to not just look at two-dimensional maps. All those images and maps I showed you are two-dimensional. To start working in 3D. This is an image that Brad created, is from thermal, and I think you've seen this in our newsletter already. So allowing us to look at the sides of the canopy, not just the top, so the whole sides, and you see how easy it is to see a low stress area than a high stress area because we're looking at the side of the canopy. So that's thermal, 3D imaging. And the last example I'm going to show you is the most recent one Brad's been working on, is point cloud image analysis. So these are images that are synthesized or created from drone flights, and they create images in 3D that you can actually move around and view the vines from any vantage. So it's really good for architecture characterization, vertical canopy spectral analysis. Here's that same vineyard where we can get a close-up on these individual vines. As I said, you can view them from any direction, do spectral analysis on the sides of the canopy. Where we're putting them to use right now, and we've just started this work last year and continuing into this year, is looking at disease and nutrition impacts on leaf density and pigments. Also, the work that Jose Urbez Torres is doing in this vineyard is he's done some treatment of trunk disease vines, like pruning them back and looking at the recovery of the architecture over time, so you can understand how useful that would be. Here's an even more, you can see the individual pixels here, and these areas, we can pick areas and then look at the spectra on those areas. So you can see it's probably a good time for me to leave as all this new modern stuff is coming out and somebody new to take over that can, I think they hopefully be just as excited as we are about this work. This is Brad here. Not a good use of Brad's time taking photosynthesis measurements because he has these other talents. Unfortunately, the other very wonderful person is Steve Marsh, and he's only half in the picture, but he's also been a huge part of our program and done a lot of work, particularly in the GIS, but also in the stress physiology work. So as I said in the beginning, I really want to acknowledge how great the industry's been working with us and our team, and we have some of the best support in the world in terms of researchers, and we really appreciate it. Now it's the Canadian Grapevine Certification Network, so we're working more across Canada, but it's a similar situation for us. Over and above that, we have additionally these collaborating wineries and vineyards that aren't just contributing to the funding of our work, but are actually working along with us in their vineyards and their wineries. And Kathy can tell you how many wines she's tasted that we've made from our research, poor thing sometimes. And we really, really appreciate it. It makes a huge difference to the work. And I also already mentioned our technical staff who we think are amazing. So with that, thank you very much. I think I will stop sharing.
Oh, Pat, that's amazing. I wish we had hours and hours. That's I'm sure there's a lot of questions. I think because there's so many people on the call, I'm going to ask people to put their questions in the chat. If you could do that quickly. Or maybe I'm just going to have to let you just shout them out because typing is hard. Oh my God, where did I go? Oh my goodness, I can't believe no one has any questions.
Yeah, they're maybe taking a nap.
Maybe that it was just such a comprehensive presentation, Pat. Okay, here we have, Pat, have you thought about using any predictive digital mapping techniques for soils or other data? That's from Stephanie Vickers.
We've certainly looked at whether the tools that we have would be, and Steffi would know this. I mean, she's a soil scientist, so she'd know this. In other areas, they've done a lot of, usually on larger landscapes, they've made great use of imaging and digital tools to look at soils. Vineyard, and we have done this with Tom Lauer. We've had bare ground versus some coverage of dormant cover crops versus live, and looked at, you know, the soil heating and things like that. But as far as other soil qualities, other than temperature and perhaps, you know, color of soil, you know, our focus has been more on the vines because we're supposed to be on the physiology of the vines, but it's something people could look at. But I would say it's kind of challenging in vineyards because of how complex the vegetation is, and trying to separate the vegetation from the actual soil in these measurements. I know she does a lot of X-ray scanning of the soils, I think, or ground-based scanning to look at what's in the soil, and that's a complicated area, very soil oriented.
Maybe Scott, maybe that's a question for Scott.
Yeah, she knows Scott. She works with Scott because he consults with her, and yeah, it's great to have someone like her in the Valley, actually. It's good.
So Alexander Revin says, how can growers put into everyday practice?
Which part? Overall? Okay, so if we're talking about the carbon, I know we get a lot of questions, how can I add carbon, and what is it worthwhile, and things like that. Some of our results are showing, you know, you need to think about what you're doing. And one of the most important lessons we learned from the prairie grain growers is how important zero till or no till has been in maintaining sequestered carbon in soils. And it's so nice to see the industry here not tilling like they do everywhere else. And I think that has led to our soils having their carbon still in them, which is good, rather than having to start from a very depleted soil like in some of the California vineyards and try to build it back up to natural. We're starting at a higher level now. So that's good. Some of the new imaging techniques like NDVI, if you're interested in someone imaging your vineyard so you can see areas of low and high vigor and try to correct those differences. There are commercial companies that can do that for you now. Our job has been to see how useful they are and take a critical view of them. I think they're very useful, particularly if you don't have time to walk through on a vineyard. I'm trying to think about what aspects there. I think how, if you're in a heat shy area like in Kelowna, and you're applying a lot of irrigation water to your vineyard because it's important to water, keep in mind that you're actually really cooling your vineyard too. So if you're struggling to ripen your fruit, you might want to think about how to manage that water differently so that you can ripen your fruit. So these are some of the things we knew that water cooled a vineyard, but it really cools a vineyard when you sprinkler irrigate. So there are all these very practical aspects, but we're trying to get a better familiarity with just the biology of the system and the ecology.
Pat, can I ask, like historically, how did we become a no-till area?
You know, I remember way back, way back, when in the Wine Grape Council used to have our conference, and we'd break out into those Q&A sessions, remember? I mean, we did that for a long time, but very early, there was some discussion. I don't really know, you know, everyone's tilling in California. You know, we just mow, we don't know. And I remember Bob Tennant saying, you know, why would we even want to till? Like, we couldn't see a reason to till, but they all till, right? Because he's had great success with just being really natural on the floor management and keeping those soils intact.
Yeah.
But the way the soils are intact, it leads to a better cycling, carbon cycling, and not this loss. So that's all I can think of. I think just everyone started doing it. Everyone copies each other. It's just like in California, everybody tills there because everybody tills there.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
They're starting to get away from that now, but that was a big part of it, a big problem.
Eric Thor is asking, are you aware of any research in the Okanagan regarding impact of animal grazing in vineyards?
I'm not aware of any. I remember when there was some discussion about sheep. And when Glenn McGurty came and he was talking about sheep and using sheep, it has its pluses and minuses dealing with sheep. You have to take care of the sheep, and there's manure and things like that. But I'm not aware of anyone who's done work in that. There could be, but I'm just not aware of any. And it would be challenging. I know Mission Hill is employing chickens now and working really well to do cutworm and pest, and that's working well. It's easier to manage chickens, but livestock, like for grazing, that's challenging.
Yeah, I talked to Rob A. Church about it once, and he, because of the bighorn sheep natural population, he said they wouldn't even consider going there because there is risk of introducing disease to the native population. So
that's a really important point. Yeah. Very important. Yeah.
Have you applied this GIS technique for disease monitoring based on the spatial changes of climate variable temperature within the vineyard?
That's something that Jose has worked on, and I mean, things like powdery mildew. If you looked at that map I showed of microclimate and temperature, I didn't show this, but we also have humidity maps too. And you can see by just changing the floor management, how you create a lot of humidity. And there's been so much modeling on humidity effects on mildew, for example. It's pretty clear that you're going to get mildew problems from that, just by understanding how that microclimate works. Now, Jose, for diseases, they've been using the mapping a lot in this, he and Tom Lowry as well, to like with their surveys on virus, on leaf roll in particular, like where they're seeing it in the races and where it's moving in the valley and not. So it's being employed quite a bit by that program using the mapping.
Great. Hans asked, back to the carbon sequestering, any recommendations on how to increase CEC values in coarse soils in the south? Additions of zeolites, clay, etc.
Well, he gave a good answer in the end, because if you're trying to do it with carbon, which really increases the CEC, it just doesn't stay. So if you can add something like a mineral and get it to percolate in, that's a good idea to try. I mean, they're not going to go anywhere because they're a mineral, and then you would have that increased cation exchange. It sounds to me like a really good idea if you can get it into the soil, like wash it in. And the soils are so coarse that you might be able to move that in with just water. So good idea. Do some research, Hans.
Maybe he could find a researcher to do that. Are there conclusions on the best vine type or varieties for soil type established and new GI?
Yeah. So I'm going to answer the question I think it was, is is recommending cultivars for within a GI. Yeah. And this is the common sense thing, is most of what limits the cultivar is the climate, the heat, whether you can ripen it or not, or whether it'll ripen too early, like some of the whites ripen too early down south in their qualities, is matching the cultivar to the climate of the GI and trying to target that ripening period. So it's in a time when you bring the best quality out of the fruit. So not too early and then not too late. So you just can't get it fully ripened. So that's the key. In terms of the soils, there's a lot more scope for managing soils, and with different cultivars, you might get different styles, but really the number one determinant for the best cultivar will be climate.
Lisa Wombold is asking for best management practices to mitigate potential soil degradation from mechanical cultivation under vine, as more growers are switching to zero herbicide.
Right, that is, Lisa, a really good question, is how to manage that in-row without Roundup anymore. And so I've talked about how tillage is bad, but not all tillage is the same. Maybe that French plow surface scraping isn't that bad. And we really need to look at that before we pan any kind of tillage or, gentle tillage in the row. But I would say the perturbation is the enemy, right? So the less you can dig in there and add those nutrients, the better. And I've seen growers in the valley doing a really good job. I also saw up the road here a mower that goes around the vine, so you're not touching the soil at all. That mower only works on really flat vineyards because it has to be stable. But I was super impressed with it. Of course, it always looks good, but in practice, it can be challenging. But there really needs to be more work on weed control in the row, and because we're going to lose Roundup sooner or later. And then you have to ask, what did we do before Roundup? Everyone grew grapes. Good question though, Lisa.
Jacques Olivier has a really good question, which was my next question. Is this information, maps, samples, methods of sampling, etc., accessible?
So some of the information is, if it's averaged, the individual growers' maps and their soil maps are confidential. I don't think there's any way we would have been able to collect all this information if we would post up people's business information and conditions of their vineyard. So the only way we did it was we signed confidentiality agreements with the big companies, but we declared to everyone, we will not release your maps or information. That doesn't stop the grower or the producer from releasing their maps. So sometimes we get producers emailing us and saying, can you please give this consultant all our maps? And we'll say, no, but you already have them, but that's okay. We will gather them again and send them to you as a package, so then you can give them to the researcher or the consultant. So the answer is if you're interested in accessing somebody's, ask them, and then we can help solicit, but we won't send them to them directly. They're all in confidence.
And individual growers how do they request of the station?
We have repeated, hi Jacques Olivier. We have repeatedly,
hi, thank you.
Hi, good to see you again. We have repeatedly asked the industry if they want their vineyard mapping to get in the system. They just have to contact us or Steve Marsh, and we put them in the queue. So right now, or last year, we caught up on a number of vineyards we hadn't done that detailed soil work on. So we got caught up in that, and we're starting again. So we're gonna do soil carbon sampling again, that detail, and then we're gonna catch up on GPSing some vineyards and doing some soil characterization. Our problem the last couple of years is that we are restricted from entering vineyards because of COVID as a federal employee, very much restricted. So we can get agreements signed with individual companies like the big guys, which covers a lot of vineyards, But if we have to go do these agreements for every little vineyard we map, it's hard. So what we're going to do, I hope, is contract with Scott Smith and to do some, because he's done it when he used to work with us, and get caught up. But the best thing you can do is send me an email, or Steve Marsh an email, or send an email to Kate, and she can send it to us, and we'll get them on the list and do their maps. Yeah, we want to do that.
So for instance, if I mean, our vineyards are mapped from early on, like 2003, I think. We just have the basic map, and so other information overlay is probably available.
Yeah, if we have additional information, we have, or you should have 2 soil maps and a map. And I should also say, if it was mapped a long time ago and you've made changes to cultivars or new blocks,
yeah,
you can go in, update your map. And we want to do that because some of them are pretty, and we think, you know, they've had alterations. We go in and make those changes, right, just, you know, through Steve. Yeah, we want to keep it up to date. But you should, and like if you're missing things, like you have the cultivar block map, you don't have the soils, just email them, we'll send them to you.
Okay, I have one last question and some information. CGCN is hosting a webinar on grapevine trunk disease on May 27th. So Kate will have that information for registration, etc. I think it's in the newsletter. But the last question is from Bailey. Is Cowichan mapped?
Mm-hmm. The Cowichan maps? Mm-hmm. So the growers that we put the notice out there and mapped everyone who would allow us to map, those are all in the GIS, and if they want it, they can get it. If they didn't want their vineyard mapped, it's not there, and we can try to arrange to get it mapped, although it's more challenging, you might have to wait, but we'd like to do it, it's just harder to do.
Okay, thanks so much, Pat. I guess my last question is, could you come back every month?
No. Thank you, I'll be polite. No, I'm gonna miss this. See, now just this Q&A is just so nice. And don't you all really miss like the meetings where we could kind of have that, you know, the talks are one thing, but the back and forth with individual growers and you know, brainstorming over things with growers is where we get all the ideas and everything from. So that's,
oh, and for us, like
Carl and I have a vineyard, so we will kind of show up to some meetings. And
yeah, you're part of the Wine Grape Council.
We are.
Yeah, you pay your levies. I know those meetings, there's, I probably every time I walked out of there with some like mind-blowing information that you gave us, right, about like abscisic acid, or just every time it was, I do miss it a lot. But I think that this is a good forum because it's frequent. And I think, you know, we've got good participation. So
and it's easy.
Yeah, it is.
It's not the same. It's not the same.
The same.
It's easy. I didn't have to dress up as nice.
Well, only the top half. So our next meeting is Thursday, June 17th. It's the third Thursday of June, and stay tuned for the topic. And thanks everybody for coming, and thank you so much, Pat. And I can't wait to see you in person because I still will be doing that.
Well, thank you, Kathy. You're always overly kind to me. And thank you, everybody. We'll see you.
Pat.
Bye.